การเปลี่ยนแปลงการป้องกันของยุโรปความสัมพันธ์ยูเครนและการยับยั้งนิวเคลียร์ดำน้ำสู่การพัฒนาล่าสุดของความขัดแย้งรัสเซียยูเครนและผลกระทบต่อโลก
Welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're digging into the latest on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and we've got some pretty fresh articles here, some from just a few hours ago from Reuters, Deutsche Welle, RFI, and BBC. We're going to sort of do a whirlwind tour through what's happening, but more importantly, we're going to try to figure out why it matters, what it means, for Europe, for global security.
Yeah, it's an interesting and volatile period for sure, Things seem to change by the hour.
Well, maybe we can start with Zelensky's recent trip to Europe. I mean, he had that pretty tense meeting with Trump in Washington where U.S. military aid was put on hold and then went straight to the EU summit in Brussels, and the contrast was pretty striking. What did you make of the optics of that whole visit?
Well, I mean, you see Zelensky walking into the summit flanked by EU leaders, the warm greetings, the expressions of gratitude. It was a pretty clear, calculated show of solidarity. And you have to wonder about the message that it sends, especially coming right after that meeting with Trump.
It seemed like a deliberate show of support, and not just symbolic either. The European Commission is proposing this huge $800 billion defense investment plan. I mean, is this, do you think, a sign that Europe is shifting away from relying on the U.S. for their security?
Well, it could be. Suspending fiscal rules, creating a whole new loan instrument for joint procurement, so countries can buy equipment together, and attracting private capital. These are pretty big steps, and it all points towards Europe taking more responsibility for its own defense, It might even be a turning point in the transatlantic partnership.
It's a pretty big undertaking, wouldn't you say? What do you think this tells us about the EU's commitment to getting stronger, defensively in the long term?
I think it shows that they are definitely feeling a sense of urgency and they're willing to put some serious money behind it. The question is whether they can keep up the momentum, I mean, the EU has kind of a history of making these big plans that don't always pan out.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then there's this, UK-France-led coalition of the willing with something like 20 countries, mostly in Europe and the Commonwealth, who are saying they're ready to support Ukraine. Some are offering troops, others are offering different types of aid. The UK, for example, has just signed a new missile deal with Ukraine and a drone deal with Anduril. What's your take on all of this? Seems to be moving pretty quickly.
Well, the UK's actions are definitely something to watch. It's like they're stepping in to make sure that Ukraine can defend itself, especially with the U.S. hitting the pause button on aid, right? It's a good reminder that the UK has always been a major player in European security and that they're willing to go their own way, even as their relationship with the EU, changes.
It's almost as if everyone is scrambling to adjust to the idea that the U.S. might actually step back from this conflict. I mean, Trump's role in all of this is kind of complicated. He's trying to broker a peace deal, but then he decides to pause military aid and intelligence sharing, and that's made a lot of people in Europe nervous.
Yeah, definitely. And then he's telling Europe they need to step up and take care of their own defense, and people are reacting in all sorts of ways to that. Some people think it's about time, others think it's, a sign that the U.S. isn't going to lead anymore.
Speaking of mixed reactions, Macron suggested extending France's nuclear deterrent to cover other European countries. I mean, that's a pretty controversial idea. What did you think when you heard that?
I mean, it's definitely provocative. It really shows you how worried Europe is about their security with the U.S. maybe not being as involved. And, some countries like Lithuania seem to be okay with the idea, but obviously others aren't so sure. But it brings up some really big questions about what European defense might look like in the future, and how it would all work.
For sure. It's a conversation starter. And it's not like everyone is on board with supporting Ukraine either. Hungary, for example, has been blocking EU sanctions against Russia and doesn't seem too keen on providing a lot of aid. Given how close Orban is to Putin, it does make you wonder, right? Yeah. Is there something more to their stance than just political alignment, do you think?
I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, yeah, Orban's personal relationships definitely play a role, but Hungary also has these historical and economic ties to Russia that influence their perspective. It just goes to show that the EU isn't always this unified bloc, and those internal divisions, well, they can make it really hard to deal with something as complex as this.
And those divisions become even more clear when you look at public opinion. That recent Alebe poll found that a whopping 73% of French citizens no longer consider the U.S. an ally. What do you make of that? I mean, that's a pretty big shift in how people see things.
It really is. I think it reflects a growing sense of, disillusionment with the whole transatlantic partnership, maybe even a feeling of being let down by the U.S., like people aren't sure if they can count on the U.S. anymore.
And adding to that, even though the French public generally supports Ukraine, they're pretty divided on whether to pay for more military aid. It's a tough spot to be in, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real balancing act for a lot of European countries right now. They want to support Ukraine, but they also have to worry about their own economies and, anxieties about the conflict spreading.
So if we had to sum it all up, what would you say is the main takeaway here?
I think what we're seeing is that the U.S. stepping back has created this, vacuum, and Europe is scrambling to fill it, financially and militarily. Whether this is just a temporary reaction or a sign of things to come, well, I guess we'll have to wait and see. It's a pivotal moment for sure. All these old alliances, they're being tested, and Europe is really having to rethink its role in all of this, global security.
It's like they've woken up all of a sudden realizing that maybe they can't always count on the U.S. to protect them.
Exactly. And the speed at which they're adapting, it's pretty amazing. Take Germany, for example. They're actually talking about changing their constitution, loosening their debt restrictions to spend more on defense. I mean, for a country that's been, historically pacifist, that's a huge change.
Yeah, you're right. It's like the conflict in Ukraine has blown this whole thing wide open. These cracks in the transatlantic relationship, they've been there for a while, but now they're impossible to ignore.
Yeah, the U.S. moving away from Europe, it's not a new thing. It started before Trump, but his America First thing and him not being so keen on NATO, it's definitely sped things up.
So looking at all this, where do you think Europe is headed? Could this crisis actually lead to a stronger, more assertive, militarily powerful EU?
It's possible, yeah. I mean, this conflict has shown that Europe can act decisively when they have to. The EU's defense plan, the coalition of the willing, these are pretty bold moves that suggest they are ready to take on a bigger role.
That's true, but it's not going to be easy. Europe's economy is still shaky, and the EU countries aren't exactly united on anything, least of all defense. And then there's this whole nuclear question.
Macron's nuclear umbrella. Interesting idea, but man, it's risky. I mean, extending France's nuclear deterrent to other European countries, that would be a massive undertaking, logistically, politically, and, who gets to decide? Who's in control? Lots of questions there.
And it would definitely make Russia nervous. Putin's already worried about NATO expanding. Can you imagine how he'd react to a European nuclear umbrella?
It's a really, really delicate balancing act. Europe wants to stop Russia from doing anything else, but they don't want to start a bigger fight. Finding that middle ground is tough.
We talked about that poll that showed most French people don't see the U.S. as an ally anymore. I bet a lot of other European countries feel the same way.
Yeah, I think more and more people in Europe feel like they need to figure things out for themselves, like maybe they can't rely on the U.S. to always have their back. And this feeling, this shift, it might actually make European leaders feel like they can, that they have to be more independent.
But what about Ukraine? What happens to them? They're stuck in the middle of all of this. They need help, but they don't want to be used,
It's a bad situation, and honestly, probably the saddest part of this whole mess. Ukraine, they're fighting to survive, and nobody knows what will happen to them.
Yeah, they're facing down Russia, and now they don't even know if they can count on the U.S. Tough break.
It really makes you think about the human cost of all of this. World leaders talking about big plans, but it's ordinary Ukrainians who are paying the price.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the deals, the economic stuff, but we can't forget that this is about real people, real lives being turned upside down.
Exactly. It's easy to forget about the people, But behind every headline, every policy debate, there are people whose lives are being torn apart.
So what can we do? How can Europe help Ukraine without starting a bigger war? And how can they, fix things with the U.S. while also becoming more independent?
Those are the big questions. No easy answers, that's for sure.
Yeah, things are changing fast, and who knows what's coming next.
That's what makes it so interesting and so important to understand. What happens in the next few months, the next few years, it's going to affect everyone, not just Europe, but the whole world.
It's kind of a reminder that the world is changing, the old ways are disappearing, and nobody knows what the new world's going to look like.
And as always, it's ordinary people who get caught in the middle.
Yeah, it really is. It makes you think, we talk about these big global events, alliances, strategies, the economy, but at the end of the day, it's people who are affected.
Absolutely. We can't forget that this isn't just some geopolitical chess game, We're talking about real people whose lives are on the line here.
And the effects go way beyond Ukraine's borders. I mean, look at the rising energy prices, the problems with global food supplies. This is a global crisis.
Everything's connected, you know?
Yeah.
What happens in Washington, Moscow, Brussels, Kiev, it all has a ripple effect. It's felt all over the world.
So where do we go from here? What can we do as informed citizens to actually make a difference in all of this?
That's a good question, and it's one we should all be thinking about. Staying informed is the first step, I'd say. Understanding how complicated this is, what's motivating everyone, what everyone's afraid of. It's the only way to have real conversations, to hold our leaders accountable, and maybe even find a way to, help bring about some kind of peaceful resolution.
Yeah, it's easy to get overwhelmed and just tune it all out, but we can't just give up.
No, we can't. We all have a part to play, whether it's supporting humanitarian aid, pushing for diplomacy, or even just talking about this with other people and trying to understand what it all means. Even small things can make a difference, It all helps.
It's a call to action, really, for all of us. We can't just sit back and watch this happen. We need to stay informed, get involved, and be proactive in looking for solutions.
And maybe most importantly, we need to remember to have empathy. This conflict, it's not just a news story, it's a human tragedy. It's happening right now, and it's affecting real people.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone through all the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, talked about how global power is shifting, and looked at all the uncertainty facing Europe and really the whole world.
We've seen how this whole situation is forcing Europe to take a hard look at itself, at its relationship with the U.S., and to figure out what its future looks like. And it might be a very different future than what they're used to.
Yeah, and the story's not over yet. But one thing's for sure, the stakes are incredibly high. What happens now is going to shape the world for years to come.
And like we've been saying, this isn't just some far-off geopolitical thing. It's a conflict with real consequences for real people. We all need to make the effort to understand it, engage with it, and try to build a future where peace and security win out. A future where diplomacy and cooperation are more important than aggression and fighting.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its impact on the world. We'll see you next time.